I showed up for my shift and my supervisor said, 5 patients died under your care yesterday. I stood in the doorway of Warren Stokes' office at Thornhill Regional Medical Center, still holding my purse and coffee thermos, completely unable to process what he'd just said. My name is Lydia Mercer, and I'd been a registered nurse in the cardiac care unit for 9 years. I'd driven in early for my Friday morning shift expecting to check on Mrs. Patterson's post-surgical recovery and review medication schedules. Instead, Warren sat behind his desk with the hospital administrator Philip Granger and someone from risk management whose name I didn't catch. Their expressions were grave, and there was a stack of file folders on the desk between them. Warren repeated himself when I didn't respond. 5 patients under your direct care died yesterday between your morning and evening shifts. We need to understand what happened. I finally found my voice. That's impossible. I wasn't here yesterday. I took a personal day. I was in Pittsburgh visiting my sister. I have receipts, photos. My sister can confirm everything. Warren's expression didn't change. According to our records, you clocked in at 6:45 a.m. yesterday and clocked out at 7:30 p.m. Your badge was used to access the cardiac unit, the medication dispensary, and 4 different patient rooms throughout the day. Philip Granger leaned forward, his hands folded on the desk. Miss Mercer, we've reviewed the electronic health records. Your login credentials were used to access patient files, update medication schedules, and document care throughout the day. The death certificates list you as the attending nurse for all 5 patients: Margaret Hollis, Frank Desmond, Ruth Carlisle, Donald Archer, and Vera Mullins. All 5 went into cardiac arrest within hours of medication administration that your credentials authorized. I felt the room tilting. I wasn't here. Someone else used my credentials. Someone logged in as me. I can prove I was 300 miles away. The risk management woman, whose badge read Suzanne Clarkson, spoke for the first time. Miss Mercer, we understand this is shocking news, but we need to follow protocol. The state medical board has been notified. There will be an investigation. In the meantime, we're placing you on immediate suspension without pay pending the outcome. We'll need your badge, your access card, and any hospital property in your possession. Warren added. The police are also being notified. 5 deaths in one day involving the same nurse raises serious questions about potential criminal conduct. I handed over my badge with shaking hands, my mind racing through yesterday. I'd woken up at my apartment, driven 3 hours to Pittsburgh, spent the day with my sister Rachel and her kids, had dinner at a restaurant on the south side, and driven home late. I had credit card statements showing gas purchases in Pittsburgh, restaurant receipts, photos I'd taken of my niece and nephew at the park. I had text messages with Rachel planning the visit. I need to get a lawyer, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Philip nodded. That would be advisable. We'll be conducting our own internal investigation, but this matter is now in the hands of law enforcement and the medical board. You'll be contacted for formal interviews. I walked out of the hospital in a daze, employees I'd worked with for years staring at me as I passed. News traveled fast in hospitals. They already knew something terrible had happened, and they were watching me leave under suspension. I sat in my car in the parking lot, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to understand. 5 patients dead. My credentials used. My login accessed. Someone had impersonated me, used my identity to administer medications that killed 5 people, and I had no idea who or why. I drove straight to Rachel's house, calling her from the road. She was stunned when I explained what had happened. But you were here all day yesterday. We have dozens of photos, video clips of the kids. My neighbors saw you. This is insane. I needed her to start documenting everything. Times I'd arrived and left, places we'd gone, people who'd seen me. She started making a list while I drove. By the time I got to her house in Pittsburgh, she had a detailed timeline and had contacted 3 neighbors who'd seen me throughout the day. I spent the afternoon pulling together evidence, bank statements showing purchases in Pittsburgh, toll road receipts from the Pennsylvania Turnpike, my phone's location history showing I'd been in Pittsburgh all day, photos and videos time-stamped throughout the day, text message exchanges with Rachel from the week before confirming plans. I had an airtight alibi proving I couldn't have been at Thornhill Regional yesterday, but someone had been there using my identity, and 5 people were dead because of it. I called a lawyer that evening, someone Rachel's husband recommended who handled medical malpractice defense. Barbara Tennant agreed to meet me the next morning at her office in downtown Pittsburgh. Barbara was in her 50s, sharp and direct. She listened to my story without interrupting, reviewed the timeline and documentation I'd assembled, and leaned back in her chair. You have a solid alibi for your physical location, but that doesn't explain how someone accessed your credentials and logged into hospital systems using your identity. That suggests either someone stole your login information, or someone with system administrator access created false records to frame you. I'd been thinking about that all night. My password is complex and I change it regularly. I never write it down. I don't share it. But people at the hospital know my routine, my schedule. If someone planned this, they'd know I took a personal day yesterday. Barbara made notes. We need to find out who had access to your credentials and who had motive to frame you. Walk me through any recent conflicts at work, any situations where someone might have felt wronged or passed over. I thought through the past 6 months. There'd been a promotion opportunity for a nurse manager position that I'd applied for but didn't get. The position went to someone with more administrative experience. I'd been disappointed but hadn't made an issue of it. There was a medication error incident 3 months ago where I'd caught another nurse, Colleen Vance, about to administer the wrong dosage to a patient. I'd reported it through proper channels, and Colleen had received a written warning. She'd been angry about it, said I'd made her look incompetent in front of the patient's family. Barbara focused on that. Tell me more about Colleen Vance. What's her role at the hospital? I explained that Colleen wasn't actually a nurse. She worked in medical records administration, handling electronic health record management and system access for the cardiac unit. She'd been trying to transition into nursing, had taken some courses, but had failed her boards twice. The medication error had happened when she was shadowing nurses as part of a training program. My report had gotten her removed from that program. So she has administrative access to medical records and she has a grudge against you, Barbara summarized. That's a starting point. We need to hire a private investigator to look into her background, her access levels, and whether she had means and motive to frame you. She recommended Raymond Keller, an investigator who specialized in medical fraud cases. We met with him that afternoon. Raymond was methodical and thorough, asking detailed questions about hospital systems, security protocols, and the specific patients who'd allegedly died under my care. 5 deaths in one day is statistically impossible in a cardiac unit unless something catastrophic happened, Raymond said. We need to verify that these patients actually died and examine the circumstances. If the deaths were real, someone administered something lethal. If the deaths were fabricated, someone created false records. Either way, this required significant access to hospital systems. I returned home to my apartment that evening and found reporters waiting outside. The story had leaked. Nurse suspended after 5 patient deaths, read the headline on the local news website. The article described me as a veteran cardiac nurse placed on suspension pending investigation into 5 deaths that occurred under my care. It quoted an unnamed hospital source saying the deaths showed a suspicious pattern. My name and photo were included. Within hours, the story spread across medical news sites and social media. I became the latest angel of death case, joining a grim list of healthcare workers accused of murdering patients. Comments filled with speculation about my motives, my mental state, my history. People I'd never met were calling me a monster, demanding I face the death penalty. The hospital released a statement expressing condolences to the families of the deceased patients and emphasizing their cooperation with law enforcement. They didn't mention that I'd been 300 miles away when the deaths allegedly occurred. My phone started ringing with calls from reporters wanting comments. I didn't answer. Barbara had instructed me not to speak to media under any circumstances. The police contacted me through Barbara on Sunday requesting a formal interview. We met at the district attorney's office Monday morning. Detective Luis Cordova and his partner Detective Amy Thornhill led the interview with prosecutors present. I walked them through my timeline for the day in question, providing documentation for every claim. Detective Cordova reviewed the evidence carefully. This shows you were in Pittsburgh, but it doesn't explain how your credentials were used at the hospital. Can you think of anyone who might have had access to your login information? I told them about Colleen Vance, about the medication error, about her role in medical records administration. Detective Thornhill made notes. We'll be interviewing hospital staff and reviewing security footage. If someone impersonated you or used your credentials fraudulently, we'll find evidence of it. The prosecutor, a woman named Ellen Shapiro, asked pointed questions about my relationship with the deceased patients. Had I treated them before? Did I know them personally? Did I have any conflicts with their families? I explained that I'd cared for 2 of them during previous admissions, but the other 3 I'd never met. Ellen seemed particularly focused on the medication records showing lethal doses administered under my credentials. These medications, potassium chloride and insulin, were given in amounts sufficient to cause cardiac arrest. That's not an accident. Someone intentionally administered fatal doses, Barbara interjected. Which proves someone with medical knowledge and system access committed these murders and framed Miss Mercer. She has an ironclad alibi proving she couldn't have physically been at the hospital. You should be investigating who had the means and motive to use her identity. Detective Cordova acknowledged that. We're examining all possibilities. But Miss Mercer, you should know the hospital's preliminary investigation found no evidence of system intrusion or unauthorized access. According to their IT department, the logins using your credentials came from hospital terminals you normally use, at times consistent with normal shift patterns. From the hospital's perspective, everything looks like you were there. That was impossible, but it suggested whoever framed me had sophisticated knowledge of hospital systems and had carefully crafted evidence to support their false narrative. Raymond called Barbara that afternoon with initial findings. He'd been reviewing publicly available information about the 5 patients who'd allegedly died. Something's wrong with the death records, Raymond said. I can find obituaries and death certificates for Margaret Hollis and Vera Mullins, but nothing for the other 3 patients. No funeral home notices, no death certificates filed with the state, no Social Security death records. It's possible the information hasn't been processed yet, but it's also possible those patients didn't actually die. Barbara and I met with Raymond at his office to review what he'd found. He'd pulled records showing that Frank Desmond, Ruth Carlisle, and Donald Archer had all been discharged from Thornhill Regional the day after they'd allegedly died under my care. These 3 people are alive, Raymond said, showing us discharge paperwork with dates from the day after the supposed deaths. Someone created false death certificates listing you as the attending nurse, but the patients didn't actually die. This was pure fabrication. The implications were staggering. Someone had created fake death records for 3 patients while 2 others had died from what appeared to be deliberate overdoses, all designed to frame me as a serial killer. Barbara immediately filed a motion with the court demanding all hospital records related to the 5 patients, including the original death certificates, medication logs, and system access records. She argued that the evidence suggested fraud and fabrication, and that I was being falsely accused of crimes that partially hadn't occurred. The judge granted the motion and ordered the hospital to produce all relevant records within 48 hours. The hospital's lawyers pushed back, citing patient privacy and ongoing investigation, but the judge wasn't sympathetic. If false death certificates were created bearing Miss Mercer's name, that's a serious crime. Produce the records. When the records came through, the fraud became undeniable. The death certificates for Frank Desmond, Ruth Carlisle, and Donald Archer had been created in the hospital's electronic system but never submitted to state vital records offices. They existed only in the hospital's internal database, accessible only to someone with administrative privileges in medical records. The signatures attributed to me were digital forgeries, scanned versions of my signature taken from legitimate documents, but inserted into fraudulent certificates. For Margaret Hollis and Vera Mullins, who had actually died, the medical records showed massive overdoses of potassium chloride administered through their IV lines, but the administration times had been altered to coincide with when I was supposedly on shift. Pharmacy records showed the medications had been dispensed using my credentials, but security camera footage from the pharmacy at those times showed someone else retrieving the medications. The footage was grainy, but the person's height and build didn't match mine. Raymond enhanced the footage and showed that the person was wearing scrubs and a surgical cap that obscured their face, but certain physical characteristics were visible. Female, approximately 5'6", specific walking gait, distinctive watch on left wrist. He started comparing this figure to known hospital employees. Meanwhile, Barbara demanded the hospital produce complete system access logs, showing every instance of my credentials being used on the day in question. The logs revealed suspicious patterns. My credentials had logged into multiple terminals simultaneously, which was physically impossible. At 3:15 p.m., my login was active on a terminal in the cardiac unit, another in medical records, and another in the pharmacy, all at the same time. This proves the credentials were compromised, Barbara told the prosecutors. No single person can be logged into 3 terminals in 3 different locations simultaneously. Someone cloned her access or had administrator-level ability to spoof her credentials. Detective Cordova brought in the hospital's IT security team for questioning. They were forced to admit that their systems had vulnerabilities, that someone with administrative access could theoretically create false login records, but they maintained no unauthorized access had occurred. That position became untenable when Raymond discovered that Colleen Vance had accessed the system logs themselves multiple times in the days after my suspension, behavior far outside her normal duties. She'd been trying to cover her tracks, viewing and possibly altering records of her own activities. Barbara filed a formal complaint with the medical board providing all evidence of fraud and demanding my suspension be lifted immediately. The board scheduled an emergency hearing, unusual but warranted given the circumstances. At the hearing, Barbara presented the timeline proving my alibi, the evidence of fabricated death certificates, the system logs showing impossible simultaneous logins, and security footage showing someone else retrieving medications using my credentials. The board's attorney acknowledged the serious concerns raised by this evidence. The board voted to convert my suspension to administrative leave with pay pending criminal investigation outcomes, and to note in their records that substantial evidence suggested I'd been framed. It wasn't full exoneration, but it was progress. The story shifted in the media. Nurse may have been framed in patient deaths, read new headlines. Articles detailed the fabricated death certificates and impossible system access patterns. Some outlets apologized for earlier coverage presuming my guilt. Others doubled down, suggesting I might have had accomplices. The damage to my reputation was done. Even people who believed I was innocent now associated my name with patient deaths and murder accusations. Detective Cordova called Barbara requesting another meeting. They'd arrested Colleen Vance that morning on charges of fraud, forgery, and murder in connection with the deaths of Margaret Hollis and Vera Mullins. She'd initially denied everything, but when confronted with system logs showing her accessing my credentials, creating false records, and retrieving medications from the pharmacy, she'd asked for a lawyer. The search warrant executed at her home had found notebooks containing detailed plans for framing me, including my schedule, my normal routine, and a list of patients who could be targeted. The notebooks also referenced other people, suggesting Colleen hadn't acted alone. Detective Thornhill showed us photographs of the notebook pages. She recruited at least 4 other people to help with this, people who had grievances against you or the hospital. We're identifying them now based on names and references in these notes. One name jumped out at me immediately. Diane Sorrell, a nurse I'd worked with who'd been fired 6 months ago for repeatedly showing up to shifts under the influence of alcohol. I'd been one of several nurses who'd reported concerns about her behavior to management. Diane had blamed me specifically, said I'd destroyed her career out of jealousy. Another name was Kevin Pratt, a physician's assistant who'd been passed over for a promotion that went to someone I'd recommended. Kevin had accused me of sabotaging his career by giving negative feedback during his evaluation, which wasn't true, but he'd believed it. A third name was Angela Moss, a pharmacist who'd been reprimanded for inventory discrepancies that I'd noticed and reported. She'd been forced to pay back the hospital for missing medications. The fourth person wasn't named clearly in the notebooks, just initials TR, and references to someone in administration who could help manipulate records. Over the next week, police arrested Diane Sorrell, Kevin Pratt, and Angela Moss. They also identified TR as Troy Ramirez, an IT administrator with high-level system access who'd been having an affair with Colleen Vance. All five were charged with conspiracy to commit murder, forgery, fraud, and a litany of other crimes related to the scheme to frame me. The prosecution's theory was that Colleen had organized the conspiracy, recruiting people who had grievances against me, and together they'd planned an elaborate frame-up that would destroy my career and possibly result in my imprisonment for murders I didn't commit. Margaret Hollis and Vera Mullins had been deliberately overdosed by Diane Sorrell, who still had friends working at the hospital who'd let her into the building. The other 3 patients had been selected as targets for fabricated death certificates because they were elderly and seriously ill, making false claims of death more plausible. The preliminary hearings revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Colleen had accessed my personnel file and copied my login credentials months earlier, working with Troy to create duplicate access that could log in as me without triggering security alerts. They'd studied my schedule and waited for a day when I'd be away from the hospital. The personal day I'd taken to visit Rachel had been perfect timing, not suspicious since I'd scheduled it weeks in advance. On that day, Troy had created false system records showing me clocking in and accessing various terminals throughout the day. Diane had entered the hospital using a visitor badge provided by someone still working there, retrieved medications from the pharmacy using a cloned credential card Angela had created, and administered lethal doses to Margaret Hollis and Vera Mullins. She'd done this wearing scrubs and a surgical cap to avoid identification on security cameras. Kevin Pratt's role had been to help create the false death certificates for the 3 patients who didn't actually die, using his medical credentials to make the documents appear legitimate. Colleen had then inserted these documents into the hospital database, backdated the records, and ensured my name appeared as the attending nurse on all 5 death certificates. The plan had been to wait until I returned to work, then have Warren Stokes confront me with the accusations in front of hospital administration, ensuring maximum humiliation and immediate suspension. The trial took place 9 months after that morning when Warren Stokes had accused me of killing 5 patients. All 5 defendants faced the same charges, though prosecutors offered plea deals to Troy Ramirez and Angela Moss in exchange for testimony against the others. Both accepted, agreeing to testify about the planning and execution of the conspiracy. Troy testified about creating the false system records, explaining in technical detail how he'd manipulated login data, access logs, and timestamps to make it appear I'd been at the hospital when I was actually in Pittsburgh. He'd covered his tracks by accessing the logs afterward and altering records of his own activities, but he'd made small mistakes that Raymond's analysis had eventually caught. Angela testified about creating the cloned credential card used to access the medication dispensary, and about Colleen's recruitment efforts, how she'd approached people known to have grievances against me and pitched the frame-up as justified revenge against someone who'd wronged them all. The prosecution called me to testify about my alibi, walking the jury through the timeline of the day in question with documentary evidence supporting every claim. They called Rachel, who testified about my visit and the time we'd spent together. They called the restaurant owner where we'd had dinner, who remembered us and confirmed the credit card receipt. They presented cell phone tower data showing my phone had been in Pittsburgh all day. The most damaging testimony came from Diane Sorrell's former colleague who'd let her into the hospital. Teresa Wolcott, a cardiac unit nurse, testified that Diane had contacted her saying she needed to retrieve personal items from her former locker. Teresa had met her at a side entrance and walked her to the locker room, not realizing Diane intended to murder patients. "I thought I was doing a friend a favor," Teresa testified, crying. "I didn't know she was going to hurt anyone. If I'd known, I would have called security immediately." Diane's defense attorney tried to argue she'd been manipulated by Colleen, that she was a vulnerable person with substance abuse issues who'd been exploited. But the prosecution presented evidence that Diane had researched lethal medication doses weeks before the murders, showing premeditation and intent. Kevin Pratt claimed he'd thought the death certificates were for training purposes, that he hadn't known they'd be inserted into real patient records, but his own text messages with Colleen discussing making Lydia pay undermined that defense. Colleen Vance showed no remorse. Her testimony was cold and calculated. She admitted to organizing the conspiracy, but characterized it as justified punishment for nurses and doctors who destroyed careers through petty complaints and reports. "People in healthcare act righteous, but they're vindictive," she said. "Lydia Mercer cost me my nursing career by reporting one small mistake. She deserved to know what it felt like to lose everything." The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts against all 5 defendants on all major charges. Diane Sorrell was convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Margaret Hollis and Vera Mullins. Colleen Vance was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, forgery, fraud, and numerous other counts. Kevin Pratt, despite his claimed ignorance, was convicted of conspiracy and fraud. Troy Ramirez and Angela Moss, having pleaded guilty, were sentenced as part of their cooperation agreements. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 2 months later. During that time, families of Margaret Hollis and Vera Mullins filed civil suits against all 5 conspirators, against the hospital for security failures, and initially against me before their lawyers realized I'd been completely exonerated and was actually a victim myself. The hospital settled those suits quickly, paying millions to the families while admitting no wrongdoing, but acknowledging system failures that had allowed the conspiracy to succeed. The hospital also reached out to me through lawyers proposing a settlement for damages to my reputation and career. Barbara negotiated aggressively. The hospital had initially suspended me without pay, had failed to investigate the impossibility of the accusations before taking action, and had allowed the media narrative to destroy my reputation. We demanded full back pay, compensation for emotional distress, funding for therapy costs, and a public apology. The hospital agreed to everything except the public apology, which they said would complicate their litigation position with the victims' families. We settled for a substantial payment and a private letter from the board acknowledging the injustice I'd suffered. At the sentencing hearing, family members of Margaret Hollis and Vera Mullins provided impact statements describing how their loved ones had been murdered in what should have been a place of healing and safety. Margaret's daughter talked about her mother's fear of hospitals, how she'd finally convinced her to get necessary cardiac care, only to have her murdered by someone wearing scrubs. Vera's son described his mother's final hours, how she'd been doing well after her procedure, how he'd left the hospital confident she'd be home soon, only to get a call that she'd gone into cardiac arrest. "Someone killed my mother for no reason except to frame an innocent nurse," he said. "That's not just murder, that's using my mother's life as a weapon against someone else. It's unforgivable." The judge's expression was grim throughout the impact statements. When it was time for sentencing, he addressed each defendant individually. To Diane Sorrell: "You murdered 2 people in cold blood to serve a conspiracy of revenge. You betrayed every principle of the nursing profession and exploited access to vulnerable patients to commit the most heinous crimes. This court sentences you to life in prison without possibility of parole on each murder count, to be served consecutively." Diane started crying, her attorney putting a hand on her shoulder. To Colleen Vance: "You orchestrated this entire conspiracy, recruited co-conspirators, planned the murders, and framed an innocent person for crimes they didn't commit. Your actions resulted in 2 deaths, destroyed Miss Mercer's career and reputation, and undermined public trust in healthcare institutions. This court sentences you to 50 years in prison with possibility of parole after 40 years. Kevin Pratt received 15 years for his role in creating false death certificates and participating in the conspiracy. Troy Ramirez and Angela Moss, having cooperated with prosecution, received reduced sentences of 8 and 6 years respectively, with recommendations for parole after serving half their terms. The judge concluded by addressing me directly, though I sat in the gallery rather than at the prosecutor's table. "Miss Mercer, I want to acknowledge the extraordinary injustice you've suffered. You were accused of heinous crimes you didn't commit, suspended from your profession, publicly vilified, and forced to defend yourself against a sophisticated conspiracy. This court hopes that today's sentences provide some measure of justice and closure. You have this court's deepest apology for the ordeal our system put you through." I appreciated the words, but they couldn't erase the trauma of those 9 months between accusation and conviction. The nightmares where I was surrounded by dying patients I couldn't help, the paranoia about everyone around me potentially being part of another conspiracy, the inability to trust my own profession anymore. I'd been cleared, vindicated, compensated financially, but I couldn't go back to nursing. Every time I thought about putting on scrubs, entering a hospital, caring for patients, I felt panic rising in my chest. The hospital offered me my job back with full seniority and benefits, but I declined. I couldn't walk those halls knowing that someone had used that place to orchestrate murders and frame me. I couldn't work with colleagues who'd believed I was capable of killing patients. I used part of the settlement money to go back to school, getting a master's degree in healthcare administration and patient safety. I found work with a nonprofit organization that developed protocols for preventing medication errors and improving hospital security systems. I spoke at conferences about my experience, about how vulnerable healthcare workers were to false accusations, and how systems needed better safeguards against credential theft and record manipulation. Some medical professionals criticized me, saying I was making it harder for real victims of medical negligence to be believed, but others understood that false accusations and genuine malpractice were separate problems that both needed addressing. I testified before a state legislative committee examining healthcare security standards, describing how easily Troy Ramirez had manipulated system records because hospitals prioritized cost savings over robust IT security. The legislature eventually passed new requirements for electronic health record security, including multi-factor authentication, detailed audit trails, and mandatory investigation protocols when impossible access patterns appeared in logs. Small changes, but possibly enough to prevent another conspiracy from succeeding as easily as Colleen's had. 3 years after the trial, I received a letter from Vera Mullins' son thanking me for the patient safety work I was doing. He'd heard me speak at a conference and recognized my name. "My mother's death was weaponized against you, And I'm sorry for that additional trauma, he wrote. But I'm glad you've found a way to honor her memory by making hospitals safer. That's the best outcome from this tragedy. I kept that letter in my desk, a reminder that justice wasn't just about punishment but about preventing future harm. Diane Sorrell died in prison 4 years into her sentence, a combination of untreated health conditions and the reality of life imprisonment breaking her down. Colleen Vance adapted to prison, reportedly working in the law library and filing endless appeals that went nowhere. Kevin Pratt, Troy Ramirez, and Angela Moss all served their sentences quietly, expressing varying degrees of remorse in parole hearings when their times came. I didn't follow their cases closely, didn't need to know the details of their prison lives or eventual releases. They'd stolen months of my life and years of my career, but I refused to let them occupy any more mental space than necessary. I'd survived, rebuilt, and found purpose in a different way than I'd originally planned. That was enough. On the 5th anniversary of that morning when Warren Stokes accused me of killing 5 patients, I stood in front of a room full of medical students delivering a lecture on healthcare ethics and the importance of evidence-based practice. I told them my story, watching their faces shift from shock to outrage to understanding. Trust but verify, I told them. Build systems that protect both patients and providers. Document everything. Question accusations but investigate thoroughly. Never assume guilt or innocence based on emotion or convenience. One student asked if I'd ever forgive the people who'd framed me. I considered the question carefully before answering. Forgiveness isn't about them. It's about me refusing to carry their hatred forward. They made choices that destroyed their lives and damaged mine. I choose not to let those choices define my future. That's my version of justice. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.